Hi there. Welcome to a YouTube video made especially to satisfy my own ego. So if you don't want to hear me rambling on and on about cast iron pots and pans for the next 20 minutes or so, you'll probably want to skip this video. A number of collectors have made YouTube videos showing off their prized acquisitions, and I felt like making one just to say what I've learned about the pieces I've collected in the past 5 years, since I began cooking and using cast iron. All of our cast iron pans have stories behind them, with some being more personal and sentimental than others. And one of my favorites is my very first cast iron pan, which I call my redneck pan. It's a large 10-inch skillet, and 5 years ago it was my only piece of cast iron. When I found it on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, I'd forgotten all about it. It had been given as a wedding present a full 8 years before and never used. It's an interesting item to give as a wedding gift, and for some reason I can't figure out where the person who gave the pan bought it. Can you? Anyway, I was advised to take that pan with me, and a month later I used it to cook a steak on my stovetop. And that was all it took to get me started as a newfound cast iron groupie. All I know is this is my first cast iron skillet, and it will be an heirloom, even if it is my redneck pan. Meanwhile, I'd received an Amazon gift certificate for Christmas in 2010, and in January of 2011 I used it to acquire the first piece of cast iron I'd wanted for myself, and that turned out to be the large cast iron wok, which I still use at least once a week, and my collection began growing from there. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to give a long and detailed explanation of every pan in my collection because I don't think your sanity could take it. We'll start with the smallest skillets in my pile and work our way up from there, beginning with the number 3. These are a Griswold slant logo dating to sometime between 1910 and 1920, a Wagner number 3 from the 1930s or 1940s, a Birmingham Stove Range skillet dating from the 1970s, and a pan with a completely unmarked bottom. Based on the shape of the pan and the handle, folks on the cast iron cooking group think this may be a Vollrath or possibly an older Wagner. Moving to the number 4s, we have a small logo Griswold from the 1940s and an older Wagner number 4 from around the 1920s. We can tell its age because this pan still has a heat ring. Wagner changed its skillets to a round bottom without a heat ring in the mid-1930s. The number 5s are a single notch lodge from the 1920s to 1930s and a BS&R number 5 from the years 1966 to 1967. Birmingham Stove Range introduced their automated production equipment in 1966, and that was when they began producing pans with the size measurement marked on the bottom. They began adding Made in USA marks to their pans beginning in 1967, but didn't completely mark all of their patterns and molds with Made in USA until 1968. So we can accurately date this BS&R to anywhere between 1966 and 67, or possibly 1968 at the very latest. From here, we have a small logo Griswold number 6, also dating to the 1940s or early 1950s, and then my number 7. This is a 19th century gate-marked skillet, and it's become my cornbread pan, as I almost always use this one for baking cornbread. The pattern of this skillet was very common in the late 1800s, and it's believed to have been based upon the design of a foundry called Excelsior that produced iron cookware in the mid-1800s. There's a theory among collectors that the pattern for this pan was sold or acquired by a number of small foundries, and many companies produced skillets with this same handle shape. So this particular design with the teardrop shape and the gate mark bottom immediately identifies it as a 19th century pan. However, without an actual manufacturer's mark, it's impossible to tell exactly who made it. And now for the number 8s. If there is any cast iron skillet you almost certainly need in your collection, it's a size 8. This was probably the most popular size, and the 10-inch skillets sold today still roughly match the size 8. I'm proud to own an Erie size 8, made by Griswold around the year 1905, and I bring this one out for cooking on special occasions. This next number 8 is actually unknown, but collectors feel it may be either from the Blacklock foundry or among the earliest pans produced by Lodge after the Blacklock foundry burned down and was rebuilt as Lodge cast iron. The general estimate on the make of this pan is somewhere between 1900 and 1910. Even though it's a number 8, it's actually a little smaller than most other number 8 pans, and it's closer to a size 7 for most 20th century cast iron makers. What's more, it has one of the thickest and heaviest bottoms of any pan I've ever held, especially for one of this size. It's not warped, and it would take a heck of a lot of heat to warp this skillet. Next is one of my favorite daily users, a BS&R Red Mountain size 8. BSR pans were largely unknown until fairly recently, and the Red Mountain series was long thought to have been produced from the 1930s to the 1940s. In fact, it had a much longer run, and Birmingham Stove Range produced these pans all the way until the mid-1960s, before the design was changed with the introduction of automated production equipment. BS&R actually changed the name of their entire cookware line to Century Cookware in the year 1957, but they did not change the design of their pans for another 10 years. They kept producing the same pans, but labeled them as Century pans. Of course, without the label, we don't have any identifier to tell whether this was produced as early as the 1930s or even as late as the 1960s. But it's still a beauty of a pan. It sits flat, and it has a glass smooth surface. Also among the same size as the number 8 is this Wagner chef skillet, likely dating to the 1950s. This is my number 9, even though it doesn't have an actual size mark. It's one of several gate mark skillets with a fancy handle design, and it's also the thinnest and lightest cast iron skillet I've ever found. I was fortunate enough to find this at the world-famous Brimfield Antique Show, and I paid a total of $25 for this, plus a Griswold number 9 lid. The lid just happened to fit the pan perfectly, even though this skillet was definitely not made by Griswold. The guy selling this also said that of the $25 cost, most of it was for the lid. And here is a Griswold large logo number 10 pan, plus a matching skillet lid. I bought this not too long after I began using and collecting cast iron, when I was a newbie who couldn't control myself. I bought it on eBay in 2011, and then I went to the Brimfield Antique Show for the first time and saw the exact same Griswold pan selling there for half of what I paid. That was my life lesson, and while I do still browse eBay regularly, my purchases there were few and far between because antiques on eBay are far overpriced. From here, we get into the really big, monster-sized pans, such as this BS&R Red Mountain number 12. The number 12 probably dates to the later Red Mountain series of the 1950s or 1960s, as the number 12 is in a professional and thin style font. On the other hand, this number 12 BS&R Red Mountain lid has a number 12 that actually looks handwritten. Several of these Red Mountain pans with handwritten size numbers have been seen, and they're believed to be among the very first series of Red Mountain pans from BS&R from the 1930s or possibly even earlier. This lid has a reddish shade of color that I haven't been able to season over, and I suspect it was damaged by fire at some point in its history. Let me introduce you to Stumpy, my 14-sized BS&R. The interesting thing about this skillet, aside from its huge size, is that it has the 14 size mark of a Red Mountain, but it has a Made in USA mark. Discussion of this among BS&R collectors came to the conclusion that the foundry probably reused an older Red Mountain mold, even after they had begun using automated production equipment after 1966. So that would almost certainly date this pan to the year 1967 or 1968. And that brings us to my Griswold size 14 skillet. It's a large logo pan, which means it was made during the 1920s or possibly 1930s. It's much thinner and lighter than the BS&R 14, and that's actually why I also acquired the BS&R. In addition, there's also a gate-marked hanging griddle that I found at an antique store on Valentine's Day. These griddles make excellent cast iron pizza pans and baking sheets. Of all the pans in my collection, the one I least expected to own is this modern Finex 12-inch skillet. It was a Christmas present from another cast iron user here on YouTube, the Culinary Fanatic. And here I have to admit to breaking a standing rule I've made for myself. I've sworn to be a user rather than a collector, and I make sure to use all of my cast iron pans. However, I did end up succumbing to temptation and getting these pans, all from Lodge, just as collector's items. The small skillet was a memento of the 2015 National Cornbread Festival, and it was also at the National Cornbread Festival where I received the skillet on the right as another gift. Finally, we get into the odds and ends, such as these oval pans. Today they call these fajita pans, though they were marked as sizzle servers by vintage manufacturers such as Wagner. These are modern-day Asian-made serving platters given as presents by my brother and my parents. We can't forget this Lodge square grill pan, which is excellent for searing steaks, hot dogs, and fish. And then we move to my baking pans, especially this Birmingham Stove Range cornbread skillet. There are some odd coincidences about this pan that give it personal significance to me, including the fact that the patent pending mark on the bottom indicates it was manufactured in 1967. Since I was born in 1967, that makes it special to own a pan the same age that I am. Speaking of cornbread, these are cornbread pans from BS&R on the left and Lodge on the right, while above is an old mountain muffin pan given as a gift from a friend at work. And then there's this Camp Chef bread loaf pan, which I got from Amazon because it was just slightly larger than the Lodge loaf pan. That doesn't really matter because any cast iron pan will give you the best bread you have ever baked. I have a few enameled cast iron pans, and I should start by mentioning one of my first genuine scores and still one of the best. In May of 2011, I came across this huge Le Creuset enameled Dutch oven, or French oven, at a flea market for only $6. Yes, $6. It has some wear on the inside and the lid is missing, but the enamel isn't chipped, and this has been a great pot for making pasta sauce and stews. It was because of the enameled pot that I had the urge to go out and find a cast iron lasagna pan, which I did find in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There was no manufacturer listed with this pan, which means it's made in Asia, but there's nothing wrong with that, and it makes a great pan for making dishes with lots of tomato sauce. And a little smaller than the Le Creuset is this 6-quart Lodge enameled Dutch oven, acquired as a birthday present in 2014. Meanwhile, I came across this enameled oval roaster at an antique store just outside Binghamton, New York, earlier in 2015. It's less than 12 inches wide and probably about 3-quart size. It's made in England, and we don't see many British-made cast iron pieces here in the United States. And I won't forget these tiny half-pint Dutch ovens, also given as a birthday present by my parents. This lets us move on to my cast iron pots, Dutch ovens, and cauldrons, beginning with these Lodge pint-sized kettles. I won these on Lodge's Facebook page in 2011 when they had a pizza recipe contest. They didn't come with the lids, but I found the lids at Lodge's factory store this year during the National Cornbread Festival. One of my most used pots is this BS&R 2-quart saucepan, which I use for cooking rice. Once you've made rice in cast iron, you won't have any need for a fancy rice cooker. I don't have many legged camp ovens, but I'll certainly be keeping this Lodge 8-inch camp oven that I won as a door prize at the 2011 National Dutch Oven Gathering. In addition to being treasured for that reason, it's also a very handy pot for slow cooking in my convection oven. Also of note is this 19th century Scotch bowl. Many of those rounded iron bowls are very thin and often cracked, but this one is thicker than most, and it's in excellent condition with a smooth inside surface. The bottom of the bowl has sulfur damage from cooking fires, so any sign of a manufacturer's mark has been removed. Next up is one of my favorite and most often used pots, my Griswold large logo number 8 Dutch oven. This particular Dutch oven can often be seen selling on eBay for $100 or more, but I was fortunate enough to discover this at Brimfield for $10. It was like finding buried treasure. It was covered with rust inside and out, lying on the ground at the bottom of a pile of junk. I took the time to clean it up, and the lid was a special present from a friend. Believe me, I offered to pay for the lid, but he insisted on sending it. When I cooked with this for the first time, I was amazed at how smooth the surface was, both inside and out. Along with my wok and my number 8 skillets, this is one of the most used cast iron pieces in my kitchen. The bottom of this pan includes the patent number, which suggests it was made in the 1920s. Of course, if you want to cook for family and friends, you need a larger pot than the number 8 Dutch oven, and that's why I'm glad to own and use a Birmingham Stove Range number 10 size Dutch oven. This heavy-duty pot was made after 1967 and before BS&R added mold ID numbers in the mid-1970s. I acquired this one after having no less than 2 Wagner number 9 Dutch ovens suddenly crack during use. After that, I wanted a much heavier and thicker pot, and this one fits the bill just fine. It was also a great score on eBay. An estate sale vendor was selling this pot for $75, but it had a buy it now option. I entered a bid of $40 and didn't expect them to accept the offer, but they did. It was worth every penny, especially when I get to use it to make dishes like this. I've had quite a liking for Birmingham Stove Range cast iron pans, I think because they're so heavy and durable, and also because they're still mysterious and unknown to so many cast iron users. BS&R made a lot of really useful items over the years, such as this oval fish fryer, which dates from anywhere from the 1930s through the 1960s. But even though I love this and use it regularly, I couldn't pass up what turned out to be a bargain when I saw this more modern Lodge deep fryer on eBay. The vendor was trying to pass this one off as a Griswold, and when I pointed out it was actually from Lodge, I was able to get it at a substantial discount. But one of my most prized possessions is this BS&R spider. Spiders with handles and legs are fairly easy to find, but it's not so easy to find one with the original lid. Most people assume spiders were only made in the 19th century, and I was as surprised as anyone to learn BS&R was making spiders all the way into the 1970s. This spider doesn't have a Made in USA mark, but the tab handle on the lid shows it was certainly made after 1966. On the other hand, this is definitely a 19th century piece. It's an Erie stovetop kettle made by Griswold in the 1890s. You can find these pots easily at many antique malls, but they're almost always rusted through, and they usually have holes punched in the bottom to make them into planters. That's why I couldn't pass this one up when I found it in excellent condition. The lid was acquired separately, and it's even older than the kettle, likely dating to the mid-1800s. The lid weighs almost as much as the kettle itself. And that's still not my biggest pot. During the summer of 2012, I went on a camping trip with friends, and I found I needed a really, really huge cast iron pot, bigger than anything made from Lodge. So I got this 4-gallon Bayou Classic Dutch oven from Amazon, and I found it to be really useful when I need to make huge amounts of food. It's also done a great job cooking Thanksgiving turkeys. Which brings me to the last and possibly the greatest piece in my cast iron collection. This was a score I couldn't say no to because I knew if I passed up on this one, I'd be kicking myself for the rest of my life. It's a 15-gallon cauldron from the early 1800s made by Savery of Philadelphia. I plan on using this one for making huge pots of jambalaya, chili, and deep-fried turkeys, and I definitely have plans to bring it with me when I embark on a camping trip to a spiritual retreat next summer. And that covers just about all of my collection. If you're still watching this video, then congratulations on putting up with my ramblings. I did try to make this as interesting as I could, and I can only hope you enjoyed this look at a hobby that I'm proud to share with you. Thank you for watching.